Should capture both of you? Yeah.
Oh, wait, do I still need this then? Or no?
Yeah, you do, because that's for in here, just so you feel like you're heard through the room. And this is for the,
Okay.
actual, recording and for the list.
Should I talk into this as well?
Is it easier just to put two mics on? Or no? Oh wait, this just got hidden.
Yeah, so is it okay? Like,
Okay.
this can sit here. So, I don't think you'll need to speak into the mic because you already have the lapel mic on. So in our audio, you're good.
Okay.
And this should capture both of you well enough for the live stream.
Okay.
So that's just super clear.
So we don't need to switch back and forth on the mics, do we?
No.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll hold this for questions towards the back so we can just walk around.
It's also a pretty small space. I feel like we could just project. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
So the Senate district is a super district. Plus, I think in 2016, the Republican who won that seat won by like 60 points. And then in 2018, the Democratic River flipped it by like 4 or 5 points. It was a major flip because in 2018 we had a huge Democratic wave. And in 2020 she held on barely. I think she won by less than 2,000 votes. But she held on. She had a good race. And then in 2022 there's going to be a huge Republican wave that it's going to be tough for her to hold on. And as far as Tina, for her to get out of the primary, she's going to have to go super far right. Which again, I hope she doesn't because I think it would be unfortunate.
I mean, as far as, and I don't know that much about Tina, even including during the time that we were back together, but like she was at this conference when her first go around and she was kind of like saying certain things. And I remember my uber conservative friends who like one of my friends, her husband was like first the speechwriter for Mitch McConnell. And actually most recently was Assistant Secretary of Treasury. So like, and she was like, Tina, I don't even understand Tina. Like she's just so to the right. Like she believes in zero gun control.
Yeah.
So I think she will go far right. I mean.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, it's politics. Politics does find inclusive people. Like there's people that having run down a bunch of times, just seeing how some of these folks are in front of a camera versus off screen. You think they're two different people altogether.
Yeah. Hey, I used to work with Josh Hawley. I used to work with Josh Hawley at Beckett. So, I mean, I think it's a different, slightly, but that it goes to the point about being really different in person versus. Yeah. You were on Fox one time? Oh.
I was talking to her offline. I'm like, no cameras, no recording thing, just what's your deal? Like, this is nuts.
Yeah.
She goes, no, I mean, there's some people who want to do harm, sure. In
Who
every community.
are what?
So she's like, there's people who want to do us harm.
Oh.
Okay,
Yeah.
there's people who want to do us harm.
Yeah.
But you guys think all this harm, all this, and you don't
Right.
actually believe that too. She goes, well, no, that's not how you say it. But it is. So you either convinced yourself that the message people are getting from you is not what you're saying, or you're lying to yourself that you're not demonizing all Muslims that you are. If you don't actually believe all Muslims are evil, you get your shit off. Of course not. Why don't you say that publicly? And she never answered.
Oh yeah, I had
It's the money, like, it's just a show. What it was like, the paper.
Oh, for sure. What's his name? Fred. Totally blanking. The guy that was part of the National Security Council, but he used to head up CSP. I mean, not Frank Gaffney, but the Fred something. He started a thing because I quoted him saying something in the Washington Post and like in my own piece, and then he just on the Islam is not a religion stuff, which I had a bunch of op-eds, and he was like, I never said Islam is not a religion. He's like, but on Twitter he's coming at me, and I'm just like, you said that like all of the vast majority of our mosques are preaching violence. You're making these sweeping comments about like vast sectors of our religious exercise, this is just pure, kind of like semantics, and that you're trying to be like literal about it. I'm like, you're getting at the same time. Yeah.
I saw Sean Hannity about this thing too. And I'm like, come on, Sean, you gotta understand this is nonsense. And I'm not gonna bring sectarianism into today's conversation, but he brought it up. He goes, well, you guys are good Muslims. No.
Yeah.
Cut that out. That's not helping anyone. It's not.
I'm going to go ahead and make this section so people can continue to come on. And then, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, assalamu alaikum everybody. I wanted to take a minute to welcome you on behalf of Make Space. We're really excited to have Asma and Qasim here with us for today's program. So for those of you who might be new to Make Space, our vision is to build an inclusive and compassionate community, and we try to do that by providing spiritual and intellectual educational opportunities like this, and community bonding spaces and opportunities. So I hope you'll continue to join us. For our future programs, you can join us on social media or follow us on our newsletter. And we'll talk to me or Elise, there are a couple people in here. And I want to go ahead and introduce Qasim, who is serving as our moderator today. He is a human rights lawyer and the host of the Qasim Rashid show on Sirius XM. He received his JD from Richmond. He was a Democratic nominee for U.S. Congress in 2020, and he's written pieces for Time, the Washington Post, the New York Times, Politico, NPR, and the list goes on. So he also recently published a children's book as his debut children's book, Hannah and the Ramadan Gift. So I'll now hand it over to Qasim. Thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you so much to you, Amna. Thank you, Asma, for being here with us today, and thanks to each of you here and watching online. I think for folks online, if you have questions, just tweet the handle, and we'll do our best to get those into the conversation as well. These kind of conversations are really critically important because ultimately, what we're trying to accomplish here is to build a narrative of compassion, of understanding, of justice. And I often point out that whatever you think of the world in which we live, whether you're as far left as it comes or as far right or just a devout centrist, we have to understand that where and address injustices today or misinformation today, it will take time. It will take massive investments. Sometimes it will require moving mountains, but you don't move a mountain unless you start moving mountains first. And the folks who are leading the way, like Asma, I'm going to talk about her in just a moment, are not doing so for personal gain or glory. They're doing it because they see an injustice and they see the impact it has on society, and they want to create a more compassionate and thoughtful world in the future. And my gratitude to each of you for being here and being part of this conversation. In one sense, I'm preaching to the choir. I've often said that the most valuable thing anyone can ever give you is their time. Because money comes and goes, food comes and goes, but time, it only goes. And so for you to invest your time in this conversation, to be here on this wonderful Saturday afternoon, it speaks to your desire to be part of a process of understanding, of engagement, and dialogue. And that's really what, again, this is going to be about today. So as we continue and kind of think about the questions that you want to formulate, I would make two requests. One, obviously keep the questions civil and cordial, but don't hesitate to ask the tough questions. I know Asma, I know she's always up to answer those tough questions. And the second rule is simply respect each other's questions as well. What may be something that's simple or trivial to you could be very serious and consequential to someone else. I first met Asma, we were just talking about this a minute ago, back when I was still a law student. It's been a decade now. And I was adamant that I wanted to get involved in human rights law on religious freedom issues. And one of our mutual colleagues connected us and said, Asma is the person that you want to speak with. And I'm always impressed by people who are accomplished, but always make time for those who are trying to get to their level of success and accomplishment. And so immediately the fact that Asma was so willing and open to meet with me, let me pick her brain, probably ask my fair share of silly questions as well. To me, it spoke a lot about her character and her integrity. And if you followed her trajectory, even not just over the last decade, but her entire career trajectory, especially in the post-9/11 America, you find someone who has two really important qualities. One is a sense of compassion and upholding justice. I've known a lot of activists and lawyers and politicians, pundits, whatever descriptor you want to put, who will be extraordinarily passionate about one issue or another issue, but to the point of being blind to other injustices. I call it selective activism. And one thing that's extraordinarily impressive about Asma is that she is, in my view, one of the few people out there who isn't a selective activist, but is actually genuinely committed to upholding justice for all communities. That's a really powerful testament, especially in this day and age when there's so much divisiveness, and you can't say one thing without taking off one community versus another because of the lack of justice. The second thing that I think Asma brings to the table that's really important is a sense of consistency. And consistency is so critical this day and age because of the exhaustion we all feel whenever we're trying to create progress or create change. Sometimes the change seems incremental. Sometimes it feels like we're moving backwards. You put in time, you've contributed money, you attended events, you've knocked on doors, or you've made phone calls, but then we don't achieve the goal, and in fact, things may be even get worse. That's where consistency really matters. And so when you have someone of Asma's scholarship create these kinds of opportunities for us to have dialogue, and hopefully disseminate that information to more people to be involved or engaged. I always cherish those opportunities, and so I'm grateful to make space for inviting me to moderate this panel, this forum. But before we jump into questions, I would love to have Asma address us and just kind of share highly her work, her background, and then we can jump into questions for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Sure, well, thank you. And I'll start by saying assalamu alaikum, and thank you for coming out here. So thank you. I didn't really expect all that, but I think you touched on, I think, really critical themes and the essential sort of nature of my work. And consistency is a huge part of that. And with regard to that, I mean, I think if you were to sort of describe the work that I've done, it's pretty much encapsulated in the two books that you see here. One, the one that we're going to be focusing on today, which is titled When Islam is Not a Religion. And the second one, which is called The Politics of Vulnerability, which I actually released during COVID. So the first book, you might be wondering, what is this title, When Islam is Not a Religion? And it's really centered on this idea, this claim that I heard, and I first heard this in 2010 while working on a court case that involved the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and the Muslim community there wanted to build a mosque, and they got all the requisites, zoning permits and approvals, and then there was a group of citizens in Murfreesboro who actually challenged this in court by saying that Islam is not a religion, and so because not a religion, it is instead, in case you were wondering what they said, it is instead a dangerous political ideology, and for this reason, Muslims should not be able to benefit from all the different statutes that actually protect religious exercise, including the ability to build houses of worship. So at the time, it was just really kind of bizarre and fringe, even though the Department of Justice actually got involved in this case in this tiny court in Murfreesboro. But at the time that I wrote the book, at the time that I pitched the book and wrote it and published it, all of that happened during the Trump era. And it was unfortunately kind of a sense of urgency that I felt that the same people who had developed these talking points, that Islam is not a religion, and have been working very consistently and diligently to kind of get that idea out there, were now very close to the president. And we're actually many of the advisors, many of his advisors, such as Sebastian Gorka and Steve Miller and a bunch of others, ascribe to some version of this idea that Islam is not a religion. And you might not have ever heard it because it comes in different forms. There's actually a nonprofit specifically set up to verify this. It's called the Center for the Study of Political Islam, and they have determined that only 16% of Islam is a religion, and the rest of it is politics. And of course, how they define these things is something we can discuss. 16%. They've got it down to a number, and you would, again, you would just laugh. And then all of a sudden you hear people like Tony Perkins, who heads up the Family Research Council and sits on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and so on, basically repeating these claims. You've also probably heard it by the people who push the so-called anti-Sharia laws. So 43 states have proposed a total of 217 bills, and it's based on this idea that Islam and Islamic law is also ultimately politics. It's all just sort of an attempt to take over the United States, and so therefore we should limit this form of religious exercise.
The Murfreesboro Mosque is a really interesting case study because I think that was one of the first high-profile situations nationally where a Muslim community was doing something that was very run-of-the-mill, which is building a mosque, and received overwhelming opposition from it. I think one of the most ironic things about that opposition is that RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, federal act, which came into existence to protect the building of houses of worship. And it was a bipartisan push. It was driven by right-wing conservatives because they felt that they were being persecuted. They wanted to have more federal legislation. Then for that same group to then get behind opposing a mosque that they had just passed a law to protect the building of. I mean, the irony of it is really remarkable. And there was violence involved. The mosque was set on fire. And I'm not sure if they discovered who was behind the arson, but I did some research on this, and a little known fact is that over the last 5 years, there have been over 250 mosques in America that have been either firebombed or vandalized or broken into or suffered some kind of desecration. And that's a statistic that I think very few people know. What does it speak to our national discourse that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim sentiment is still, to put it bluntly, an acceptable form of bigotry, and how do we overcome that?
Sure. I mean, so to go back to the statute that he's talking about, it's called RLUIPA. It was proposed by Senator Orrin Hatch, who actually endorsed that book. And it was passed in 2000, just months before the 9/11 attacks. And at the time, that the Congress was listening to all this evidence about why you needed special protections for houses of worship, mosques were actually barely on the radar, as you note. There was all kinds of discussion about every other type of house of worship, including, of course, churches. But people weren't really thinking about mosques. I think there were 2 anecdotes total that were shared. And then suddenly, within a few months, 9/11 happened. And at the time, it was 14% of all DOJ investigations related to houses of worship became related to mosques. And today, I think the number is actually much higher. It's like 24%, which is really remarkable if you think of the fact that Muslims only constitute 1%. I mean, some people would argue 3%, but 3% is pushing it, but we're still constituting 24% of DOJ investigations. And that point that you bring up about how it was oftentimes Christians who are asking for protection, but the second that protection is extended to mosques, there's to sort of back away from this idea. I mean, that's actually what I'm tackling, and I tackle it more sort of explicitly in the second book, the subtitle of which is How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations in a Post-Christian America. And it's noticing, in the space that I work on, and you also mentioned, I mean, that's a instance of inconsistency, but in my experience in my career, I've really tried to be as consistent as possible, even at times like today, when it's usually not a very popular thing to do to defend the rights of conservative Christians. But because I've been in this space where I've worked on these cases, very sort of publicly defending Christians who are conservative, who often have beliefs that a lot of people in the US today find really problematic, and we can get into that. It relates, cases, and I haven't worked on it, but to give you an example, a case like the Christian cake baker who doesn't want to make a cake for a gay couple. And again, that wasn't a case I worked on, but that's sort of like the sphere of things that we're now dealing with. And the law firm that I worked at for a long time and continue to sort of work closely with, even if I'm not there, actually represents pretty much like all the religious liberty claims at the US Supreme Court. So I'm happy to kind of talk about that. But yeah, I mean, just in the course of that, it was just like, there's so much attention being paid to religious freedom. And during the Trump campaign, the Trump presidency, I don't know if you were paying attention, but religion and religious freedom was like the top priority. In fact, Ted Cruz, as a presidential candidate, actually called the 2016 campaign the religious liberty campaign. And it was like, all the GOP candidates are kind of like, jostling with each other to prove themselves the biggest savior of religion or religious freedom, by which, of course, they mean Christianity and specifically traditional Christianity and religious freedom for those Christians. But at the same time, they're also proposing things like let's shut down the mosques and spy on Muslims and create a registry and ban Muslims and everything. And it was just sort of like, this was the most stark example for me as to how you can say that religious freedom is the most important thing for you and then turn around and just like say this. And I was like, well, what's going on? And it really kind of goes fundamentally to this idea that Islam is not a religion, so we can somehow, in our own minds, think that this is logical.
Yeah, it's an inherent contradiction, and just to emphasize your point that it isn't just in the theoretical. There are really practical manifestations of this. As you said, Muslims represent 1%, a very liberal scale, 3% of the U.S. population, but anti-Muslim hate crimes are about, religiously motivated hate crimes that are anti-Muslim are over 20% of those crimes. And when we look at the discrimination, even right now, Dilawar Syed is President Biden's nominee to the Assistant Deputy of the Small Business Administration, highly qualified candidate, well regarded by Jewish organizations, Muslim organizations, Christian organizations, but he can't get a vote. And GOP is continuing to be on record that it is in part due to their concern about his faith. And so kind of going back to this about how this is still considered anti-Muslim bigotry, still considered an acceptable form of bigotry. How do we overcome that? How do we move forward as a nation? And when we talk about the First Amendment protects religious freedom, how do we make sure Islam is a religion included in that conversation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it goes to sort of pointing to the need for consistency, not just because it's a good thing to do, but because people need that in order to protect their own rights. And so, in a book with the subtitle How to Heal, I actually spent a lot of time, first laying out the problem and then talking about the solutions. And my argument, the gist of it is, hey, folks, and unfortunately a lot of the Islamophobia does come from white conservative Christians, more specifically white conservative evangelicals. I let that pass. And so what I tell them is that this thing that you think is so important to you, which I actually agree is important to you, in order to protect it, you have to also protect it from Muslims. Like that's just the nature of the law. It's not like each case is sort of an island. What is decided in the precedent and the principles that are set in one case will extend to every other case that comes after that. And similarly, when I tell Muslims, we can get to that later, that like, hey, maybe you don't want to, necessarily position yourself against these Christian claims. It's not because I think we should agree with what they're saying. It's simply because at the end of the day, it's going to create a certain precedent, and we need to be focused on the precedent that's being created because it's going to come back and apply to our situation. And so for this, when I'm speaking to sort of these, the people who have very strong anti-Muslim sentiments among these white conservative Christians, or at least people who sort of, will, regardless of their religiosity, are very passionate about religious freedom, say, hey, that thing that you think is so essential to you, that you're so dedicated to protecting, that is literally a national platform and like the basis upon which Trump was elected by the white, evangelical vote, you want to protect it, you have to do this. Because once you start carving out exceptions for a group that you don't like, those exceptions are just going to come back to you. And it's interesting because you kind of you think about, the title of this book is called The Politics of Vulnerability, and it kind of touches on this phenomenon of like the evangelical persecution complex, and I'm sure you've heard about this. And it's interesting because after the book came out, I started, seeing some discussion from other, lawyers who are conservative and Christian and speaking to their community about the need to protect religious freedom for everyone. And they're like, look, the reality is, this is what there's an actual line here in this book saying, the reality is in this country is much more likely for Christianity to be labeled not a religion and instead a dangerous political ideology than Islam is. And so why are you guys supporting this claim? Because, we feel, they definitely feel like they're under attack. They feel like, the American left is out to get them and to sort of obliterate their traditions and their beliefs. And they're just like, the chances of us being dismissed on that basis are much higher in reality than Muslims are. I mean, this is what their argument is.
And I think part of it is, so just to be clear, this is not the argument that me or Asma are making, this is the position that's being held, but I think part of it is we're seeing a rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, of young people who don't affiliate with any religion altogether. We're seeing a rapid increase. We're seeing a rapid decrease in church attendance. And there's a lot of fear as to what the root cause of that is. There's some great studies and work that go around about that. But I would submit that the religiosity of a particular community is a reflection of that particular community and their ability to communicate their message ultimately. And there should be ownership and accountability. But how do you prevent people from conflating the persecution of Christians in some Muslim majority country, take your pick, versus the alleged persecution here because we can't say Merry Christmas anymore, even though that was never the case. But you see that conflation. And how do you make that distinction to point out that, yes, there are actual grievances of Christians being persecuted, but you can't use that as an example of alleged persecution here in the United States?
Well, I would definitely recommend that you sort of consult the second book because I get into this in a lot of detail. But I don't really preoccupy myself with like trying to create distinctions between the two, although I do sort of, I'm more interested in saying, okay, this is what Muslims are going through, this is what Christians are going through, and I don't think it's helpful for us to engage in what they call sort of competing victimhood. But let's just state the facts that the situation with Muslims is much more urgent. There is this phenomenon of firebombing and mosques being burned down. It is absolutely the case. And then skyrocketing hate crimes, and you can't sort of compare physical harm to a feeling of what they call dignitary harm. But at the same time, I think what kind of sets me apart, and this goes back to sort of the theme of consistency, is to recognize issues where there are issues. And what I argue in my book is that if you insist on kind of saying that it's all sort of fake, that this is just sort of like, it only exists in their minds, which I actually don't believe that. I mean, I think it's exacerbated in their minds. And I think that there's like a sense of like, there's a best-selling author who calls it woundology, where there's a sense that they sort of like find community in their shared wounds, and they have a hard time letting go of that. But I also fully recognize that some of the stuff that they're worried about is real. It's absolutely real. And I think just being a lawyer and kind of seeing the challenges that are brought, whether they actually show up in court or whether they're sort of these other challenges that are sort of ironed out in other ways, is absolutely a very concerted effort to say that traditional Christian belief is in fact pure bigotry and needs to be, completely eliminated from the U.S. And so the sense that they feel that their religion and their traditions are being maligned and dismissed. And oftentimes, that is actually the reason why they become so anti-Muslim, because they say the political left is out to get us, but at the same time, they're totally championing these Muslims, and it just seems like, they hate Christianity and they love Islam, and that actually makes them hate us even more.
Yeah, it's a dangerous combination. I want to go back to one of the excerpts from your book, When Islam is Not a Religion, that really spoke to me. When you start your chapter, I think Islam hates us. And you refer to the incident where the former president is having an interview with, I think, Anderson Cooper of CNN, if I'm not mistaken. And he just makes a statement that I think Islam hates us. This really kind of outrageous, bombastic statement without any kind of context. And you write about how your son Isa was coming into the room and you turned the TV off because that's not something you wanted to expose your then 6-year-old to. And that resonated with me because, I experienced the exact same thing with my kids. What's the advice? I'm gonna make you a parent columnist now. What's the advice to parents out there who are dealing with this real trauma? Everything from hearing Islam hates us to we know that hijab-wearing women are more likely to be attacked simply because they're much more visible, to how Muslim do I show myself on a job application or a resume? Do I change my name from Qasim to Kevin so I have a higher likelihood of getting a call back? What's that balance look like where we can live in our safety and security without compromising our faith and values?
Yeah, so I think that one, I feel like I've thought of that question in like various forms, being a parent of 3 kids. And, for me, it's just like, I think my kids are now getting older, so now the more complex issues are going to come up, and I think the answers sort of evolve as they grow and as you grow. But for me, it was like at a young age to sort of like instill in them an understanding of what their religion was from like as spiritual perspective as possible, right? I think that there's a lot of sort of politicization of religion and our religion specifically, and sort of people kind of think about it more, or almost primarily from like a social justice perspective. And I'm like, first and foremost, just think about it in terms of your relationship with Allah. Like that is the core of it. And if you can sort of root yourself in that, then what happens to you in terms of what people are saying or even trying to, the basis upon which they're attacking you, I think becomes much more easier to resist. And I think, there was a moment where I was like, I think I'm doing this correctly. My daughter was 7. She was asked to, she was filmed for this Washington Post video where they had like different kids reflect on, different religious questions, like, what do you think of God? Or where does God live or whatever? Which apparently he lives in Egypt, according to my daughter. And I was like, what is she thinking of? Like Makkah? But and I remember she was watching the video when it was done, and these 2 atheist kids, were also interviewed, and they said, Allah doesn't exist, right? Or not Allah, obviously, God doesn't exist. And I remember just being like, it's so mean to Allah. And like the way she responded, I was like, that is exactly it. Like there's the fact that she has that sort of dedication and relationship to God in that way, where it's a source of goodness. And so that's like, it might just seem like that to me has just seemed like, a really sort of helpful parenting strategy to younger kids. And then of course, beyond that, I think things get really complex and I don't know that I have all the answers because I'm not quite there yet in my parenting. But in addition to all this, of course, taking the requisite steps to make sure your kids are safe.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that your book really strikes home on, that Islam as a religion doesn't call us to jeopardize our own safety for the sake of the faith. It's a very, moderate and logical religion in that sense, that your deeds are ultimately judged by your intentions. And there's no commandment that compels you to put yourself in harm's way to practice it. If you can't pray publicly due to persecution, you pray privately at home. If you know you're going to be attacked for identifying yourself as a Muslim, then you don't outwardly identify yourself. You don't hide it necessarily, but you don't outwardly go and looking for trouble. You try to find that middle ground of peace. Let's talk about kind of moving forward as a country as well. And I think the graduation from your first book, When Islam is Not a Religion, to the Politics of Vulnerability is such a timely conversation because of this perceived clash between Muslims and Christians. One of the common right-wing talking points is this clash of civilizations narrative that is, in my view, antithetical to history. We see in early Islam the immense alliance that the early Muslims had with the early Christians and the partnership and the mutual respect that they had with one another, along, of course, the Jewish tribes at that time as well. How do we rekindle, and I think I'm probably talking more towards your second book now, how do we rekindle that knowledge, that understanding, and that trust between faith communities so that we can stand united against our common enemies of poverty, our common enemies of violence, of extremism, and truly form not just a more perfect union, but more harmonious societies in general?
So my answer is probably not going to be one that you fully expected. But for me, it's like this moment that we're living in right now, it's so much polarization. And in fact, the precise dynamics that are created and the sort of feeling of the evangelical persecution complex, like I actually argue that the moment is ripe for this sort of bridge building, which is again what inspired the second book. And more specifically, what inspired it is that when I was on my book tour with the first one, which took me everywhere, including Dubai, and I met these guys there. It was, I was hosted by like so many different types of people from across the political spectrum. I mean, when I'm talking about conservative, I'm talking about like the Heritage Foundation, and I'm talking about evangelical universities. I'm talking about the National Religious Broadcasters, which is actually what I opened this book with, which is like this, international convention of Christian media makers, and people actually have to sign a statement of faith. And interestingly, right before me, Frank Gaffney was at the mic. And then right after him, he actually was a talk by Attorney General Bill Barr, and then I came on after that. So this was a really, really conservative space. And time and again, what I noticed, with the exception of Frank Gaffney, is that, I would go into these spaces and I would be talking about all these different attacks happening on Muslims. And, the typical response that you see today from conservatives would be like, oh my God, there we go again about the Islamophobia and like political correctness. And like, you don't really see, there has been no other Muslim invited to the National Religious Broadcasters annual convention, for example. But the thing is, when I talk about it, and again, the book is like largely sort of structured as a critique of what's going on with the political right, including most fundamentally conservative Christians, they're so open to what I had to say. And they were really interested in sort of learning more and trying to figure out ways to sort of move past that. And so I started thinking about this, and I was like, this isn't the usual response. It just isn't. You don't go into really hostile spaces where you're really critical of the other side and receive a warm welcome, especially these days. I'm like, what is going on? And so, I actually end up rooting the second book in social scientific studies, like, political science studies on religion and religious freedom, social psychology, and which ultimately ended up supporting what my hypothesis was to begin with. And that was that I went in and I said, hey guys, and I think my bio also spoke to them, that I have represented your interests, including before the US Supreme Court, including really, really contentious cases, guys, like the Hobby Lobby case. I don't know if you guys know about that case, but it really triggered the culture wars. Everybody decided that Christians are anti-women and anti-freedom, with that case. And I'm like, I get it. I understand what your issues were. I understand what your concerns were. I don't think they're fake. I don't think you're just making it up. I don't think you're making up some of it, but I don't think you're making all of it up. And their guard just went down. And if you look at studies on social psychology, they say exactly that. When you have this divides between the in-group and the out-group, the way that you create empathy is by reducing perceptions of threat. And so what I was doing, and people have commented, that, like physically, I'm also not a very threatening look. And I'm like, I think about that in the form that, Allah creates you in the package that's most conducive to your purpose. And I go in and I'm just not a threatening person, in terms of what I'm saying or the way that I look. And they just received that really well. And next thing you know, we're having conversations that I think were previously unimaginable.
Yeah. Well, I think that's perfect, right? I think having that intent to meet people where they are is a critical component moving forward. And it's a prophetic example, right? Even when the most vehement opponents of the Prophet would be willing to dialogue, he would be open to that. And one of the most famous examples is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Right before the victory of Mecca, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was a very unjust treaty. It was so unjust, in fact, that all the companions were furious that we can't go to Hajj. If somebody leaves the Muslims and goes to the Meccans, they get to stay there. But if somebody comes to the Meccans to us, we have to send them back. Despite that, the Prophet maintained that treaty, kept his word for the sake of peace. And history records how productive that conversation actually was. It was exactly what you're saying. It was decreasing the perception of threat and the actual threat, and progress was meaningfully made. So I completely agree with you on all of that. I guess my question then is, practically speaking, what does the average person do? We're not all going to be invited to these forums or have access to these kinds of audiences. Where do we begin? What does that process look like?
Look, I think the way that, in terms of like lowering perceptions of threat, I think that doesn't necessarily always have to be done from a stage, speaking to hundreds of people in an audience. It can be done one-on-one. And I think that we've all sort of, and in this scenario, I'm sort of tackling the Muslim-Christian issue, but I kind of think about it as a microcosm for all kinds of other divides. And I'm like, if in our personal interactions, we can just sort of change the MO these days, it tends to be that I'm not listening to you. I'm just kind of waiting for you to stop talking. I know I disagree with you. And so the second you stop talking, I'm going to tell you why you're wrong. Maybe take a moment to like actually listen to what the person's saying and to understand them as a human who's coming from a place of fundamental humanity as opposed to a place of bigotry or hatred, which is what we often think. And so I talk about this in the book, even with respect to people who have really extreme ideas of Islam that are really negative. And it could be anything in a Facebook exchange, right? Like in the comment section. It could be when I get off the stage and people come up to me and ask me questions like, so are you saying not all women are oppressed in Islam? And I'm like, yeah, I'm saying, that's exactly what I'm saying. But it's just like, take a moment to not be sarcastic or to sort of dismiss them as sort of hopeless, but to instead say, just be grateful for the fact that they are there and willing to engage, even if at first it's abrasive, and just sort of like get to the core of where this is coming from, which again these days I think is sort of seen as a sign of weakness or even potentially selling out. Why are you even wasting your time with those people? But I've just seen transformations that to me, and transformation doesn't have to be like all of a sudden they're volunteering at the masjid or something. Like it's more like they just go from a place of being, no matter what, Islam is horrible and Muslims are, need to be resisted at all costs, to just suddenly seeing the community and me as an individual Muslim as somebody who is human like them, and in a way that's, also related fundamentally to their spiritual outlook. And I think for me, it's like, because I've seen that, I know it's possible. I think the social psychology, I think our religious traditions all, point to that, and I think we just have to remember that.
I mean, that you nailed it. And there's also the very famous story at the victory of Mecca. A man named Ikrimah got the heck out of town. He fled Mecca, and under the assumption that he would be put to death for his crimes he had committed. He committed violent crimes against Muslims. He had killed innocent people. And his wife went chasing after him, saying that this man named Muhammad, peace be upon him, has offered amnesty to all Meccans, provided they accept these conditions of respecting religious freedom and stopping their incursion against the state. And Ikrimah came back and said to the Prophet that I'm only back to prove that your statement was wrong, that you actually will put me to death. And the Prophet's response was, well, I'm paraphrasing, of course, but you're disappointed, but I'm not going to put you to death. You are forgiven, provided you accept these conditions of accepting religious freedom and not creating further incursions against the state. And that is what ultimately caused him to accept Islam, and he became one of the most respected companions and one of the most respected personalities, despite who his father was, Abu Jahl. So you're exactly right. Meeting people where they are is absolutely critical, and I don't think it's up to us to say that some person is beyond dialogue. Until and unless somebody actively says, I refuse to engage with you in any capacity, I think it's our responsibility from a prophetic tradition to continue to make that kind of an effort. One of the things that as Muslims we see often is our own divisions, and we often fight and bicker. You may have noticed that Muslims fight and bicker amongst ourselves, but to the outside world, there's a monolith, right? When it was the Muslim ban, it wasn't the ban of any particular sect or ideology. It was anyone Muslim, and even our Sikh and Hindu friends were kind of wrapped up in that because they can often be perceived as Muslim. You talk in your book about the good Muslim, bad Muslim dichotomy. Can you kind of speak a bit more on that, and how do we overcome this type of I'll call it a trap, essentially?
Sure. So the book, I actually ended up dividing according to first the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. And so the free exercise clause section is really kind of talking about attacks coming primarily from the political right, which is really just like this very simple idea. Islam is not a religion. Muslims are therefore not religious believers. No rights for you. And establishment clause issues tend to be a question of is the government preferring one religion over another, or one type of Muslim over another, or one type of Christian over another? And so I sort of couch it in those terms. And so there's a governmental aspect of it. For example, I explained the types of studies that ended up driving a lot of policy making, including programs that ultimately led to the NYPD surveillance program, which specifically created a distinction between Muslims that were threatening and Muslims who weren't. And unfortunately, the ones who were determined threatening were the ones who were more religious, which to me is actually a free exercise problem as well. Which is if you're growing a beard, suddenly you're praying more, that's determined that you are on the path to radicalization. And they'll start sort of implanting, confidential informants, spies, and so on. And it's not limited to NYPD, continues to today. There's actually a case being heard at the US Supreme Court in November, just a few weeks, that deals with this informant, Craig Montiel, who for a decade spied on the Southern California Muslim community and gathered all kinds of information on them. So there's that piece of it, but then there's also the piece of it that I sort of shift then into my sort of social and cultural commentary, where I sort of talk about, how even the political left, this is where it gets a little dicey, where even the political left, in the way that it defends Muslims, oftentimes tends to defend us as primarily as either a racial or ethnic minority, and not as a religious minority, because oftentimes there's a discomfort with religion. And there's a lot of aspects of our religion or traditional Islamic belief and practice that might be uncomfortable, that often is uncomfortable to many people on the political left, the same way that traditional Christianity is. And so kind of calling out this idea of, again, about who exactly is being championed, for what purposes and in what ways. And so I kind of get into this, a discussion of the phenomenon of sort of the platforms that, Muslims are given. I get into, the the issue that I think erupted on Facebook about a woman in a headscarf being interviewed for Playboy magazine. We know that there was a Muslim hijabi model that was in Swimsuit Illustrated that actually came out after, or Sports Illustrated, sorry, that came out after the book came out. And similar sorts of phenomenon where I'm just like, okay, for whatever, we can have our opinion on that, but what exactly is going on here? There's a very concerted effort to sort of uplift the hijab, for example, but through a certain prism and for a certain purpose. And I think that we have to be really careful about what's going on there as well, because sometimes we're so preoccupied with the really sort of explicit attacks coming from the right that we kind of forget the more nuanced and possibly more dangerous things going on the left.
Yeah, and to even put a finer point on it, when you look at the Western wars and bombings that have been committed by both left and right-leaning administrations and organizations, it's unfair to say that only one political party is, in some respects, callous to the suffering of Muslims. By one study, 4 million Muslim civilians have been killed by Western bombs since 1990, and over 37 million Muslim civilians have been displaced over the last 40 years due to these Western bombs. And we still see an arms trade to draconian regimes that are upholding horrific atrocities, like the genocide in Yemen right now, or the enabling of the Rohingya genocide through an American company without any meaningful accountability. And so I completely agree that if we make the mistake of saying that this is just a right-wing issue, and not a justice issue, then we prevent ourselves from really upholding a sense of justice and resolving the potential conflicts in front of us. And then the NYPD spying, New York City is a pretty left-leaning city, and it occurred right in front of us. And if I'm not mistaken, after 6 years of illegal warrantless spying, not only was there a grotesque violation of due process and constitutional rights, but there wasn't a single lead they found to validate even the slightest bit of concern. Not that that would justify it, but just to add a further point to it, that nobody sees us as a religious minority that's deserving of the same due process rights in that respect. Well, I have one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience as well. And if you're watching online, you can just tag, I think, just make space, and we'll get those questions to Asma. And that really is kind of, what does the future look like? What is the next 5 years look like in terms of Muslims in America, Muslim-Christian relations, and what are some of the active steps each of us should be taking to positively effectuate that? I began this discourse by pointing out that where we are as a country is the result of deliberate actions people have taken. And if there's injustices we see, it's due to deliberate acts of injustice that have been allowed. How can we, as Americans, as Muslims, as allies to American Muslims, play a meaningful role in upholding justice to protect our communities, to protect our country, and really make this a more perfect union?
So I think that there's lots of different ways to do it, and I think each of us has to kind of focus on our piece of the puzzle. Like, we're not all going to be able to work on things, that all things are definitely not things that we, might not have as much knowledge or interest in. So for me, I always sort of limit my answers to, I stay in my lane. And for me, it's about religious freedom, which happens to be, again, I think all indication points to one of the biggest issues in this country right now, and one of the biggest questions is sort of animating the divide between the political left and the political right, and also, I would argue, between Muslims and Christians. And so for me, I'm like, again, Allah put me in a place, in a forum, in a city, working on issues that I think are so central. From the day that I started out my law firm, it was at the time a really small shop. Now it's actually this really fancy firm, again, handling all these cases of the Supreme Court. But it was like our issues were constantly in the national headlines. Like Washington Post and New York Times are always calling us. And that immediately sort of pressed upon me that this is something people really care about. And so for me, it's just like, what can I do given my expertise and my connections in the space? And for me, it's always to kind of just sort of keep pressing that this is my angle. Like, I look at people who work on Islamophobia and, pushing back against anti-Muslim sentiment, and I'm like, that is really amazing work, but it's also just really exhausting. And oftentimes, after years and years, you see, right after the 20th, anniversary of 9/11, you see that we're still dealing with extremely high rates of anti-Muslim sentiment. And so it just feels like there's a lot of work being done, but oftentimes not really having a major impact. And for me, I feel firmly that if you just focus on this question of rights, religious rights. And if you kind of come at it from a perspective of selfishness, to be frank, like what is in their self-interest, and talk to them through that perspective, then you'll eventually get to a point where they will, there'll be like, you know, interfaith relations that are premised on this idea of like, we're just good people doing good things. But until, you know, we're anywhere near that, you need to come at this from the perspective of self-interest and just talk to them about how this is ultimately the right thing for them to do for their own interest. Not for us, but for themselves.
Well said. Very well said. I think with that we'll jump to the crowd for questions. Amina, I think, is going to pass around the mic. So if you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and do a jumping jack, and we'll come to you. You have to do a jumping jack, otherwise you don't get to ask a question. That was a joke, guys. Come on. Tough crowd. Big good one.
Hi, my name is Nelson. I really like the example that you gave about like the hallucinogenic substance that was brought in for a specific religion and held up in customs, and then the case went to the court. Where does, I just wanted to understand it more better, how does the state then, where does it draw the line? For example, if it was a harder drug, and the same with like the sick child with the small knife, and so is it just like case by case basis? But if it is, then each instance have to be taken to the court, or do you have a general understanding of how this goes through?
Sure, and that actually, so he's talking about the chapter where I kind of explain what religious freedom is, because there's so much misunderstanding around what it is and what the limits are. And I actually start off the book, even in the introduction, kind of saying, look, this book is about arguing for religious liberty for all, but that is not by any means the same thing as religious, as a free-for-all. And even when it comes to Muslims, like if you see somebody who's trying to engage in acts of violence or in something that's going to compromise physical security, and just justifying that on the basis of their religion, well, that's not going to fly. And the reason is because the most stringent standard protecting religious exercise is the strict scrutiny standard, which basically says that if the government places a burden on your sincere religious belief, but then has a compelling interest to do so. And compelling interest would be things like trying to protect people from life and death issues. So if you have a Jehovah's Witness who is denying a life-saving blood transfusion to their child, well, sorry, your religion can't allow you to do that. Of course, if it's an adult who's saying that for themselves, it's a different calculation. So for the first part of it, is there a compelling government interest? And the second part is there a way to serve that interest in a way that doesn't require the government to stop these people from doing what they're doing? And I can give examples of that. And so in that discussion that you're talking about, I really kind of get into this idea of like, what is a religion and like how to, because if you're gonna say, when Islam is not a religion, it sort of begs the question, well, what is a religion? And, again, looking at this from the religious freedom angle, what really matters is how judges decide what a religion is or what is not. And so the funnier cases I talk about is the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, which, by the way, it was actually, substantively dealt with in a court, but it was ultimately determined that, the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster is not a real religion. Similarly, the Church of Marijuana is not a real religion. And so, with respect to the hallucinogenic drugs that were being used by these Native American believers, and he's not talking about Smith, he's talking about Ocentro, just in case. It's really kind of like, oftentimes it is a case by case, and sometimes it's very much even related to the broader context of who this religious community is. So there was a case of these Amish, parents who said that they wanted to pull their kids out from compulsory public schooling, after the 8th grade. And that ruling, which allowed them to pull them out, was very much based on the fact that the Amish community is a very particular insular community who has their own ways of educating and raising their own kids. And so after 8th grade, it was specifically determined that this would be accommodated, but specifically for Amish people, because that's just who they are, right? And so I think it is a case by case, but you also have to then understand the bigger principles that are being enunciated at the same time. And so this Ocentro case, the hallucinogenic drug case, was known for the fact that it required the government to prove not just as a compelling interest, but you have to show me that you have a compelling interest specifically with stopping this guy, You can't just say, we have a compelling interest generally in like preventing the abuse of drugs or like drug usage or whatever. It's like, well, why this small little tribe? Like these two people who are not, that the broader context here is that they're not engaging in any sort of criminal activity. Like, point to me why you have a compelling interest with respect to these people. And so, yeah, a lot of the things sometimes just have to be litigated, but the reality is that because this jurisprudence exists, you'll have law firms and other activists who are basically, if they see, for example, a school trying to stop you from engaging in prayer, or an employer who's not giving you a religious accommodation, they'll send what they call a nastygram, which is like, by the way, this is kind of the precedent, so you might want to think twice about the restriction you're doing, that you're placing, because you might end up in court and you're probably going to lose.
What's up? Another question for the gentleman in the lecture.
Assalamu alaikum, thank you for coming. So I love that you pointed out that it is interesting to see the left kind of look at all Muslims as a racial monolithic group. So can you speak a little bit more about how to speak with folks on the left who are technically our allies, if you will, political allies? How can we help them understand some of the differences in philosophy when it comes to religion versus their political philosophies? How can we have more of that conversation with them to kind of help them understand that, hey, there are certain things that we disagree with you on, but we're still all in the same fight here. Because I feel like that conversation is likely more ambiguous and more difficult to have with that group, rather than folks on the right who, where the objective there is a lot more clear, as you pointed out. It's, find the common ground, label and understand that we have similar issues and kind of apply that common ground with them, right? So can you speak a little bit more about how to kind of engage the left with regards to differences that we may have as a religion, and that we're not some sort of minority group, victim group that needs to be saved?
Well, I think the first part is authenticity. I think so often now, especially in and I'm not somebody who sits there and sort of does political strategizing, but it is in terms of the way that we make decisions and decide who to engage in coalition building with, we often tend to silence like different parts of our beliefs and our identities. And I've been in conferences, for example, where presidents of MSAs have come up and said, we were required to, partake in this programming with XYZ minority issue, and I think we can all guess what it is. That we didn't really feel comfortable with, but it was sort of expected of us because we're kind of lumped in with a series of other minorities. And I think it's like an act of omission is oftentimes much more detrimental than an act of commission. And so I would say just having the ability to stand up for what it is that you believe in is really critical. And I think too often. I think American Muslims are sort of feeling cowed because they think that the price of being accepted or the price of having our rights spoken up for requires us to be silent on other issues that are important to us. And again, I'm not somebody who, with sort of my experiences with the Christian examples have shown me that this is not a question of bigotry. This is not a question of hatred. This is a question of just understanding that these are our beliefs and there are certain lines that we draw, but we come from it from a place of love and acceptance of other people as humans. And I think those are really important ways to couch things. So I actually spoke at a conference that was organized by Sheikh Yasser Qadi, right before the COVID shutdown. I was on a roll, and then suddenly everything came to a halt, and that was going to be the beginning of many more conferences that are now delayed. And it was a conference, or Omar Suleiman was there too, and we were talking about sort of religion and LGBTQ rights. And for me, it was just like really, important. And the whole thing was structured and framed by Sheikh Yasser Qadi, who we all know is very conservative, as a place of like, this is not about denying entry to people into the mosque or in any way sort of like, minimizing their humanity, but it is simply a question of where do we draw that sort of space where you have to be authentic to our religious beliefs. And where is that issue then being compromised? Because we have to be able to live in a sort of diverse society where we're all sort of authentic to our own beliefs. It can't just be that one set of people is authentic and then we have to be silent. So I think that's one part of it. I think just sort of like speaking up and not being scared. And And I think the second part, which I actually get into in the book, even though it's called, How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations, I sort of talk about how Muslims and Christians are proxies for the political left and the political right. So conservative white Christians are proxies for the right, and Muslims are proxies for the left. And I think there's tons of evidence out there, anecdotal, but also social scientific. I think anybody just has to look at the Women's March that happened right after Trump's inauguration, and how one of the primary symbols of anti-Trumpism then and now is a woman in a headscarf. And there's tons of other sort of data that shows that that's how we're perceived, essentially. So I sort of look at like social science strategies around tolerance. And so tolerance is like this really fuzzy thing that's thrown around, but in the social scientific term, it's basically like, how do you begin to see people not as groups that you dismiss, but people who have very specific beliefs? And how can you show that these beliefs are worth sort of tolerating in the service of a higher goal that you're all dedicated to? And so one thing that many people on the political left really, treasure is a human autonomy, sort of liberalism, right? Our ability to engage in free speech and to be able to be authentic to who we are. And so the more you can kind of talk about how our ability to sort of speak and to practice our beliefs is core to sort of just human autonomy and liberal rights. And maybe I'm getting a little too academic here, but it's like this thing you want to protect, whether it's free speech or religious freedom, it's not possible to protect that if you're suppressing other people's right to speak. So if you're really dedicated to that, this is what you have to do, regardless of whether or not you despise what we believe. That thing you're dedicated to requires it. And I've seen this in my actual experiences when I'm giving a talk in front of a very sort of political left group that, I'll go through this whole presentation and I'll talk about the principles in cases like the cake baker case, the Christian cake baker case, or the Christian group that wanted to erect a statue of Jesus on federally owned land, or, and then I'll take it all the way from there to like anti-Sharia laws in the case that was used to dismiss, to strike down this initiative in Oklahoma. And people are just like, whoa, because they're so used to just sort of putting this stuff in this bucket and this stuff in this bucket, and they don't even realize that there's shared principles. Yeah, and so people tell me that like, you just took us on this emotional roller coaster, because we're so used to projecting this Christian stuff, but you actually made us see how this is related. And what was really fascinating for me, what really kind of made me want to write this book, is that my friends who are political scientists have actually done, there are studies being run now where they'll take like the liberal group and a conservative group, and they'll do what they could do with prime. So they'll start by showing them examples of like a Muslim, for example, a Muslim truck driver who didn't want to transport alcohol because it's a violation of his religious beliefs. And they'll show them examples like that, and then they'll switch it to like a classic Christian culture war claim. And they'll find, and they'll poll these guys before and after. And the people who are liberal will actually become warmer to the traditional Christian beliefs if they're first shown these minority things, the Muslim claims. Because it's just suddenly, as opposed to if you did the other way around. Because now all of a sudden they're just like, oh, we get how it's all connected. So I think the short answer is just kind of like focusing on that bigger goal that they're really already dedicated to, and showing how they need to sort of allow for authentic self-expression, regardless if they hate what we have to express, in service of that goal.
I would really like to congratulate you on what you're doing, and you're asserting your religion and moving ahead, and I'm glad that you're a lawyer and you can do a lot of things in forceful way. Coming to this question, how do we have a discourse with non-Muslims? I never find it a problem. This can happen anywhere. I think the problem is that we Muslims have not understood our religion properly ourselves. We need to understand that it started from Abraham, how he found God, how he submitted to God. And then, all the sequence of, the prophets coming and giving the messages of God. So it becomes very easy, and I have seen people really, they stop listening. And this dissolves all differences between different sets of religions, especially if they are from Abrahamic faith. So we have the advantage that we know the will of God and what He wants from us, from humanity, the purpose of life and everything. So I think it becomes a very good discourse with non-Muslims. And to be honest, I've never had a problem. In fact, I've enjoyed, and people told me that they enjoyed talking to me and they would like to learn more. So this comes to your question that we have to understand our own religion. It's not just 5 times prayers. It's not just the month of Ramadan for 30 days or stuff like that, or reciting this and this. That has to come with a lot of submission of our soul, of our heart, and we have to move forward. And I'm very much interested to see that Islam is spreading in America, and that's why I'm here. And you would respect that I'm senior I'm senior to you all, and I wanted to see how you guys think, how you're moving forward. But I'm surprised that you're not talking about the understanding of the Abrahamic faith, the conviction, how prophethood started. Even though God said, "I sent you messengers," but those messengers are not in the Quran.
Can you? This is a really interesting point. Can you formulate that into a question?
So my suggestion, it's not a question, but it's my suggestion, that I think that's a very strong way to move ahead with the discourse. That we understand our own religion properly, and then move ahead and see that we don't have much differences. And then what happens is that we are all humans. We belong to the same human group. As you said, poverty is our enemy. Terrorism is our enemy. We feel the same way. Doesn't matter what you believe in. I am with you. You understand? So this is just a suggestion, and I think this has been a good interfaith approach which people have employed.
So I mean, I think that the idea of focusing on the human is another way of sort of characterizing what I'm saying. When I say that you have to talk to them in terms, you have to understand their fears as real fears and not something you can dismiss as bigotry. And so in the first book, I do take into this question, for example, there's a lot of memoirs. So Qasim shared the anecdote of, that I shared of like my son Isa coming in, and I'm watching the stuff on TV where Trump is saying Islam hates us, and I quickly shut it off. And so I share a lot of other stories like that because in addition, so the book is not an academic book, neither is. And so in writing for a general audience, like I didn't want to just give them the facts, but I also wanted to connect it through human memoir. Sort of like the human stories and like this sort of, this connective element of my own life. And so every single chapter has stories of my life, has stories of other Muslims. Like when I talk about the Murfreesboro case, I talk about Imam Osama Bahlul and like who he is as a person, as opposed to just kind of like, let me give you the facts of the case. So I completely agree. And I also, in talking about Isa, point out, hey, guess what? Isa is Arabic for Jesus. And let me tell you about, and like he loves the prophetic stories. And I start going off on the, telling them about the prophetic stories because it's news to the Christian reader that we have all the same stories. So I do agree with that. I think it's, for one, I have to say that I'm not an interfaith person. So I'm not somebody who's like a religious studies professor or like somebody who's a clergy or sort of works in that space. And I always make sure to distinguish that because I have a different value add. And so when Qasim says that, what's the solution to the problem, my first response was, I'm going to give you an answer based on my expertise, but everybody comes at this differently. And for me, it's like more sort of, again, I think that the issues that we're dealing with, and almost every political scientist will tell you that the state of polarization in this country is at an all-time high. And the ability, and I think maybe because I also exist in various sort of social media echo chambers, and I see how extreme it is, that I know that the only way to penetrate through, and that's where I do see lots of Muslims, being very, very upset about a Christian win at the US Supreme Court, and vice versa. Right? And so for me, it's like, what is that problem? And if I can solve that problem, maybe it can help solve this much bigger problem of these two groups being divided.
I think that concludes our questions in the audience.
Great. we close out, any final comments or any final remarks?
Well, I think this conversation can just sort of be endless, but thank you for coming out. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. Thank you for Makespace for hosting. And I think we have some snacks and plenty of water. And probably should have announced earlier, but restrooms are around the hall in case anyone wants to use the restroom. But thank you all, and I'm going to send it back to you.
Yeah, so thank you everybody who's joining us online, and thank you to both of you for making time to come out today to make space. And Asma's book is available for those of you who might want to grab it today. You can make sure you can take care of that. And
I do have one final request, if I may. And that is that as I began, when I talked about, you know, the incredible work that organizations like Makespace are doing, I'm going to be the blunt one here and say, you guys, these things cost money. Asma and I were both gracious enough to, I'm going to praise ourselves for a second, to do this because the sheer love of this, but these organizations, there's office, these supplies that can cost money. So to whatever extent you can contribute to Makespace, it is a 501c3 nonprofit, it is a tax-deductible donation. What I would suggest is donate a cup of coffee a month. Subscribe to them for $5 a month and just forget about it, because that goes a long way towards nonprofits growing and developing this work. So if you enjoyed today, especially if you're watching online, and you enjoyed this discourse, then go to Makespace's website and sign up as a contribution, because these are the kinds of narratives that we want to drive going forward.
And to that end, I just want to say, if you guys buy a book, all proceeds, I'm happy to give it to Makespace.
thank you guys, and you're welcome to make a line. Let me know if you need anything else. I think it is almost time for lunch. If you'd like to pray, you can go to the other side through the door this way, and there are rugs down for prayer if you don't have to go. Thank you.